Welcome back to Rise of the Apprentice. Now this is part 2, so if you've yet to see part 1, I'll include a link to it in the description below. And without further ado, let's get right back into it. We're back in the large hangar bay of a rebel ship, and standing near the Outrider and a few other smaller cargo vessels are Luke and Leia having a conversation where she's telling him to just go with Ahsoka, that Dash has agreed to help Lando in the search for Han, and there's little more he can do here right now. Luke then says, half joking and half serious, that if Han were here, he'd tell me to keep looking for him instead of running off to deal with some Jedi nonsense. Leia smiles at that and says that Han might not believe, but she knows how important the Jedi are to the galaxy, that her father used to tell her stories about them when she was young, stories that, if overheard by the wrong person, would have gotten him locked away in an Imperial prison. In fact, she says the last time she spoke to her father, he sent her on a mission that was of the utmost importance, and that was to find Obi-Wan Kenobi. And thanks to that mission, Luke is here with them now. Before Luke can respond to that, they're interrupted by the beeps and whistles of R2 as he rolls up on them. And then Luke asks if the ship is ready to go, to which R2 responds with some excited chirps. Luke turns back to Leia and says, still sounding a bit reluctant about all this, that he guesses he's ready to go. Leia smiles and embraces him and says, "May the Force be with you." Luke returns the embrace and says the same back to her, and as this is happening, Ahsoka walks up on them and stops the moment she lays her eyes on R2. She's about to say something when R2 starts to beep and chirp loudly. The embrace ends and Luke asks what's wrong with him, but Ahsoka quickly answers for R2, saying that he's just impatient to get going. Luke chuckles and says, "Alright, little buddy, we're going. And with Leia at his side, Luke heads towards one of the small cargo ships. A smiling Ahsoka then goes up to R2 and kneels next to him and says, "It's been too long, my old friend. Haven't seen you since I was working with Bail Organa, back in the early days of the rebellion." She looks over at Luke, who's now boarding the small cargo ship, and says, "Seems like you're right where you belong again, watching a Skywalker's back." R2 beeps happily at that. Ahsoka then asks very seriously, "What have you told him?" R2's dome goes from side to side and he wobbles a bit and gives some negative sounding chirps. "Obi-Wan told you to tell him nothing? I wonder why," Ahsoka says. R2 makes some noises that lets Ahsoka know that he doesn't have the answer to that either. We're then on board the small cargo ship, and Ahsoka enters the cockpit just as Luke slides into the co-pilot seat. Ahsoka cocks her head and says, a Skywalker letting me fly. I could get used to this." Luke gives her a quick glance and starts to fire up the ship's engines. "Don't get too used to it," he says. "I'd fly if I had any idea where we're going." "Yeah, about that," Ahsoka says as she takes a seat next to Luke. She then goes on to explain that finding kyber crystals isn't what it used to be, that she used to take younglings to the planet Ilum to get them, but he's no youngling and Ilum is firmly in the hands of the Empire now, and apparently has been plundered for the Death Star project. She then tells him about how kyber crystals can choose and call out to their masters, which is how she found 2 new ones for her new sabers, and that, if he can quiet his mind, perhaps he'll hear one calling out to him from somewhere out there. Luke gives a slight shrug and says, "Yeah, I guess I can try," and then quickly corrects himself. "I mean, I'll do it. No such thing as trying, right?" Ahsoka gives him a look and then blurts out excitedly, "Master Yoda? Has he come to you in a vision?" Luke stumbles over his words. How do you even know that?" Ahsoka smiles at his confusion. "Do or do not. There is no try," she says. "Master Yoda used to say that to me all the time when I was a youngling." Luke will tell Ahsoka that it was more than just seeing him in a vision, that he was actually trained by him, albeit briefly, on Dagobah, and that Yoda said that he couldn't leave the planet for any reason, for fear of being sensed by the Emperor. That, and Yoda also mentioned that he had important work left to do, though he wouldn't tell him what it was. Luke will go on to say that maybe they should stop at Dagobah and seek the advice of Master Yoda, but Ahsoka will say no, that Yoda likely wouldn't be too happy with what they're going to try and do. Luke looks worried about that, but Ahsoka assures him that he wouldn't be a Skywalker if he didn't go against his master's wishes from time to time. We then get a shot of a small, lone Imperial cruiser out in the middle of nowhere, and then we're on the bridge of that ship and see 2 Imperial officers talking quietly. One of them, the captain of the cruiser, is complaining to his lieutenant about being dragged out beyond the Outer Rim because of the mad delusions of the Emperor's pet. He starts to say more, but then his face starts to go red and he paws at his throat. We hear some gurgling and popping, and soon he slumps to the ground, revealing Vader standing behind him. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Captain," Vader says calmly. The lieutenant then steps up and says, "Orders, Lord Vader?" as he tries not to watch his former superior being dragged away by 2 stormtroopers. Vader looks out into the emptiness of space for a long moment. "We wait, Lieutenant. She will come here, and Skywalker will be with her." The lieutenant nods as if that makes total sense to him, and says, "Very good, my lord," and then the scene ends. We then jump to a close-up of Luke's face with his eyes firmly shut. That lasts for a few moments before we hear Ahsoka say from somewhere right behind him, "Any luck?" Luke shakes his head and opens his eyes. "All I keep seeing is Cloud City and Vader slicing off my hand." He then sighs and says instead, "I mean, I keep seeing my father." Luke turns and with a pleading look in his eyes says, "Ahsoka, tell me, were you there when it happened? Do you know why my father turned to the dark side?" Ahsoka's eyes shut and she lowers her head. When she finally speaks, her voice is soft and full of regret. "No, I wasn't there. I left them. I left them all." Luke then asks, "Them? You mean the Jedi? Why?" Ahsoka goes on to explain that there was a misunderstanding, that she was accused of something she didn't do, and that Anakin was the only one that stood by her, who fought for her. Ahsoka then smiles and shakes her head wistfully. "Of all the things your father taught me, the most important was to believe in myself." Almost looking angry, Luke fires back, "Stop talking about what he used to be. He's not that person anymore. I faced Vader. I know that there's nothing to him but darkness and hate." It's then that Ahsoka turns and looks and sounds a bit angry herself. "For your information, young one, I faced him too, and I know there is still good in him. There has to be. Who he was has not been fully destroyed, and you have to believe that if we have a chance of bringing him back." "Bring him back?" Luke says as he storms right up to her, getting in her face. "No, he's a monster. He's chased me across the galaxy and back again, killed Obi-Wan, tortured Han and Leia, and probably gave the order to kill my aunt and uncle. I don't want to save him. If given the chance, I'd kill him. Isn't that what I'm supposed to do anyway?" Ahsoka takes a long, deep breath and then says calmly, "Is that what Yoda told you? That you're to destroy him? Or is that just what you've assumed?" Luke opens his mouth ready to fire back, but can say nothing to that. Ahsoka continues, "I'm no Jedi, Luke. I can't train you in their ways, but I can teach you something that might be even more useful to you. Belief." Luke thinks on it for a moment, but says nothing and storms away to another part of the ship. Ahsoka looks defeated and gives a sad, disappointed sigh. After a few moments, she makes a fist and looks resolute again and vows, "I won't fail him, Master. Not the way I failed you." We then get a scene of Luke resting on a cot, clearly deep in thought. When Ahsoka enters, he sits up and says, "I noticed we've jumped to hyperspace, so where are we headed?" Ahsoka sighs and just says, "Don't worry about that for the moment. I've decided we're going to do things your way. We'll destroy him. We'll destroy Vader, and we'll do it together." Luke looks utterly confused and says that he doesn't get it, and wonders if this is a test, and he's never quite sure when it is when it comes to Jedi stuff. Ahsoka grins and says that she knows how he feels, but this is not a test. She then unclips the two sabers from her belt and hands one of them in Luke's direction. Luke's eyes go wide and he springs off the cot. "You're giving me one of your lightsabers?" Ahsoka chuckles. "Hardly, but I figured you could use some lessons to build upon what Yoda has already taught you." Luke laughs. "Yoda? Use a lightsaber? He's not even as tall as an astromech droid, and he can barely walk. What could he ever do with a lightsaber?" Ahsoka smirks but then shakes her head. "Didn't he say anything to you about not judging him based on his size?" Luke thinks for a moment and then confirms that yes, he did. Ahsoka walks over and gives him one of the sabers and says, "Then don't. And stop assuming things or you're going to get us both killed eventually. And one last thing. Be ready for anything." She then quickly ignites her saber and swipes at Luke's head, who in the nick of time ignites the other saber and blocks her attack, and then the scene ends. We're then back on the Imperial cruiser and Vader, arms folded across his chest, stares out into the nothingness of space. The lieutenant from before comes up from behind and says, "My lord, something has appeared. A large object like nothing I've ever seen before. Should we—" But Vader cuts him off. "Have my TIE ready for launch, Lieutenant, and keep scanning for any other ships. When they arrive, you are not to engage them, but rather to let them approach the object. Is that understood?" The lieutenant nods and says, "Understood, Lord Vader." We then jump into the middle of Ahsoka and Luke practicing, and Ahsoka is making a few comments about what he's doing right, and also about what he's doing very wrong. They're then interrupted by R2 beeping over the comms, letting them know they've arrived just as the ship leaves hyperspace. They both turn off their sabers, and Luke starts to hand the one he has back to Ahsoka, but she tells him to hold on to it for now, because he might still need it, at least until they find his old one. Luke doesn't understand, but instead of asking, walks over to the viewport and sees that they are approaching Bespin of all places. "I don't understand," Luke says. Ahsoka answers, "This is where the Force was showing you to go to find a saber, so this is where we go." Luke starts to argue that this is a bad idea, that the saber was lost forever, that it fell into the gas giant, and that the Imperials now have control of Cloud City. He starts to tell R2 to plot a new course, to get them out of here as fast as they can before they're spotted, but then he seems to hear something calling out to him. "No, wait, R2, I hear it. I hear something," Luke says. "Someone else found it and has it. But how's that possible?" Ahsoka then tells R2 to take them in, and then explains to Luke that the last time R2 was here, when he hacked into the central computer, he found several landing codes. So landing won't be a problem, but everything else might. Now, in the interest of keeping this at a reasonable length, I'll just sum up this next part. Luke, Ahsoka, and R2 have a fun little adventure on Cloud City, taking out a few stormtroopers and working as a team to overcome a few things, much like Ahsoka and Anakin used to. Ahsoka will of course take this opportunity to teach Luke a few things. And in the end, they learn that the saber landed on a ship that was in the clouds collecting Tabata gas, and that later it was discovered by someone performing maintenance on that ship. Luke of course gets the saber back, and they manage to escape Cloud City with it. Ahsoka then uses the Force to guide them to Mortis, and of course Luke asks what's Mortis and why would Vader go there. Ahsoka explains that during the Clone Wars, she, Obi-Wan, and Anakin responded to an ancient Jedi distress call and found themselves on some strange planet that was home to three Force wielders: the son, who was of the dark, the daughter, who was of the light, and the father that kept the balance between the two. Mortis itself acted like a prison for the brother and sister, because if either one ever escaped, it would tip the balance of things too far in either direction and be disastrous for the galaxy. Anakin was lured there because he was thought to be the chosen one, and the father was dying and needed someone to take his place, keeping his two children in check. In the end, Anakin refused to stay, and all three of the Force wielders died, only not exactly. The daughter used the last of her power to bring Ahsoka back to life, and in so doing, a part of the daughter merged with Ahsoka and has been with her ever since. Then, when Ahsoka battled Vader, she would have died again if not for the power of the daughter. The only problem is that the daughter and the son are linked, and when Ahsoka came back to life yet again, so too did the son, who was likely born anew on Mortis. Their cargo ship then drops out of hyperspace, and Luke says that there's one Imperial ship on my scope, but it's not moving to engage us. A few moments go by, and we get some shots of their small cargo ship approaching some strange object, when Luke then says, "One lone TIE fighter has left the cruiser, and I know that ship. It's Vader's." Ahsoka instructs Luke to follow it, and as soon as both ships get close enough, a crack appears in the large cube-shaped object, and both ships fly into it. And thus concludes part 2. If you want to watch the third part now, I will include the link in the description below.